Board, Wednesday, December 7th, 5 o'clock. Could we have the roll call, please?
Board Member Cordaway.
Here.
Board Member Moore. Here. Board Member Blake.
Here.
Vice Chair Walter.
Here.
Chair Folks.
Here. All right, we have a quorum, we have one here. So first order of business is the approval of our minutes from our last meeting in October. Hopefully people have had a chance to look them over. Are there any corrections or changes?
I had a comment that might lead to a potential change. Just regarding the 150 Alice Avenue house. I'm wondering if we're memorializing appropriately the fact that there was 2 mini structures that were not part of the request, the permit request, and that they will need to be rectified as far as dealing with the violation, getting the permit to have those be in existence, and then getting the permit to do the roof change, right? Because as you remember, this was just a roof change to the the parts of the home that were known. And the way it's written, I'm not sure if you think that it's satisfactory. It says if the property owner bought the house with a violation, they would own the violation and need to repair as indicated by the code and the city's permitting process. But that does, I wonder if we could just add a line in there about, so that maybe 10 years from now, when they decide to try to get a permit to do the roofing and we're all off to other things, that it would be memorialized to say, and oh, by the way, at that point, once it's legitimatized, or then we could do the permitting process to make that change. I just wonder the way it's written, and it's page 2. It's right below. It's right on top of the motion. It's just a little paragraph, and I'm not sure that covers it all. So I would just ask you to, if in your opinion that covers it, and somebody could pick this up 10 years from now and know what the situation was, because I realized it was kind of a unique aspect.
If I could comment, I mean, these minutes are not meant to be a verbatim transcription of the meeting. I mean, we do record all of this now. It's posted on YouTube. So the idea of minutes is starting to be a bit passing in its original intent. The action here really comes down to the resolution that was adopted by the board, and that really focuses on what that approval, what the scope was, which is the house and any other legal portions on the site as determined by the director. Being that this particular property may actually come back to the board at some point next year, we probably shouldn't speak much more on it, though.
Okay.
Don't want
I just want to make sure.
to prejudge any future
Memorialize
actions that might come forward to the
Okay.
board.
All right, any other corrections?
Nothing.
Okay. Do I have a motion to approve?
I'll make a motion to move the meeting minutes of October 26th.
Second?
I'll second that.
All right, we have 2 seconds. Second or third. All right. Could we have the roll call, please?
Board Member Cordaway.
Yeah.
Board Member Moore.
Yes.
Board Member Blake.
Aye.
Vice Chair Walter.
Aye.
Chair Folks.
Aye. All right, wonderful. Thank you. So next, excuse me, items
Can't
oral
let me-
communications. Do we have any individuals wish to, I don't see a lot of individuals here, but you never know, who wish to address the board on matters of community interest not listed on the agenda? Seeing none, we'll move on to board and staff announcements.
In terms of staff announcements, the city council did reappoint board members Blake and Moore to another 4-year term to the Historic Preservation Board last night. Just in the nick of time for this meeting. Today, we recorded the 3 revised Mills Act contracts and provided those some of those materials to the county assessor's office. And we're awaiting confirmation from them that that's acceptable. So they did indicate so long as those contracts were recorded prior to the end of the year, they will take effect next tax year. So we have that email out to them. And then also just as a heads up in terms of keeping dates, next year's California Preservation Foundation Conference will be held April 19th through 21st. We have funding to bring 2 board members to that conference that will be held in San Francisco at Fort Mason. And so we will discuss attendance in January's meeting,
Give me the date again, please.
the 19th through 21st.
April?
April.
Go ahead. No, other announcements? No, I was gonna ask a question.
So on the 3 Mills Acts, contracts, refresh my memory, is that we can't, or the city cannot cancel the contract until 10 years are up. Then a notification could be sent out to cancel the contract, which then will extend it for another 10 years.
No, so the original contracts had a concurrent notice of non-renewal. And that was at the same time, which then had the inadvertent effect of reducing the savings very quickly after year 1.
Right.
So that went back to the council to remove that provision. So now these contracts are like all the other contracts that they run indefinitely with at any given time, 10 years of life on the contract, was every single year it automatically renews for 1 year. So as part of the Mills Act update, the council will need to decide what to do with these older contracts, if they are okay with them just running indefinitely, or if they would like to have some sort of process to issue a new notice of non-renewal. So should that happen, that can occur next year or the year after, or whatever period prescribed by the council. But when and if it does, the issuance of the notice of non-renewal would then begin the 10-year countdown.
And the city can't go ahead and do that countdown now because of that one provision in the contract, even though.
I mean, the city could,
Right.
but at the current moment, we're choosing not to.
Okay.
It's really at the council's discretion.
Gotcha. Okay.
Does the board have an opinion on that?
That will be part of the January meeting.
Okay.
And just a question just to clarify that. So if a homeowner, I mean, just making it hypothetical, decided to abandon their house and just, just leave it to rot, the city has no recourse and they still have 10 years of tax savings.
No, there's an entirely different provision in state law into the contracts that deals with a breach of the contract where the property is left in a neglectful manner. Then there's a mechanism that can impose a very substantial fine against the property owner to basically compel them to address the matter. It'd be, I'm forgetting the number exactly, but I think it's over 10% of the property's current market valuation. So it's substantial. And that would then terminate the contract, impose the fee, and then the city would need to take kind of its normal code enforcement efforts to address the property violation.
Right. So in that case, it doesn't run for an additional 10 years.
Correct.
It
At
would
that
stop
point, it'd be
immediately.
terminated.
So there is a way to do it. It's
Correct,
just
correct,
not.
yes.
by- Okay, got it. Thank you.
It's in the contract.
Yeah.
I have an unrelated question. It has to do with our CLG status and the continuing education units that we were supposed to get. And I
Yes.
don't know if we got there.
Well, the criteria for that's quite broad. So effectively, an email with the indication of here are some YouTube video links suffices for now. But yes, that's certainly an area that we should improve on
Okay.
the coming year.
Thank you.
Great. Seeing no other questions or announcements. Move on to new business. We have the 2023 board meeting schedule. People have had a chance to review it. It's the normal schedule like we have every year. The only issue that I have is that the February meeting falls on the Campbell School winter break. And so I will be out of town. So and I forgot what we have scheduled for Mills Act in February, Daniel, but I just wanted to make sure if we need to have a quorum and we've already one down.
Well, in February, we actually do not have a historic preservation code update meeting. The February item for that will be a joint study session, but that will be held on the Planning Commission's meeting date, the 28th.
Study session with the planning.
Correct. So the regular February meeting of the Historic Preservation Board. We'll just have routine business that may be on that agenda.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I'll make a motion to approve the schedule for 2023.
Do I have a second? Thank you. Could we, any discussion? Could we have the roll call, please?
Board Member Cordova,
Approved.
Board Member Moore. Board Member Blake. Vice Chair Walter,
Aye.
Chair Folks.
Aye. All right, wonderful. So we'll move on now to our study session on the Historic Preservation Ordinance update. I will say just as we start that apparently Daniel has not been able to sleep for several days because that was quite a write-up. It was very thorough and detailed that I was like, it made it so much easier to tackle this having that really good write-up. So thank you for that.
All right, so we'll take this in pieces, try and get a sense of where the board is in agreement and where the board is not in agreement. So this is the second study session on the Historic Preservation Ordinance update. The board may recall the council authorized preparation of a focused update that has basically 3 legs to it. The first was the penalty provisions that was discussed at the October meeting, and that's followed by forming the permitting processes. That's today's discussion, and then followed by a revamped Mills Act program in January. So in terms of the scheduling, how we are here December 7th at the permitting discussion, that will be followed by the January 24th meeting regarding Mills Act. And assuming the board is able to come to a consensus tonight and on the 24th, then we will look at scheduling a joint HPB Planning Commission study session on February 28th. And so that would be the Planning Commission's regular meeting. And so we would just add the study session to the top of it. That would normally start at 7:30 p.m. All right, so just a little background. So the current Historic Preservation Ordinance was last updated in 2018. This was a fairly comprehensive update. The last time it had been updated before that was 2008, which just incidentally I worked on as an intern way back when. That ordinance really tried to clarify a lot of the permitting processes and the mechanisms to add or remove a property from the list. It created a new expedited process that allowed for a lot of routine changes to structures of merit to be approved by staff under the director's authority, but then also allowing some of those changes that may be more significant and that would alter the character defining features of a structure of merit to a tier 1 historic resource alteration permit, which is a permit that's considered by the HPB in a public hearing. And so that would incorporate, again, anything basically referred from staff to the HPB, that's a structure of merit change, as well as nearly any alteration to a landmark or historic district property, which is why the vast majority of historic resource alteration permits reviewed by the board have actually been to properties in Alice Avenue or landmark properties. I think there has maybe been one just structure of merit proposal, notwithstanding 705 El Patio. Then the ordinance creates a second tier, which really has to do with extraordinary situations, demolitions, relocations, or alterations to a structure that have to do with severe economic need or circumstances. It just allows a mechanism for the city council to allow alterations that ordinarily would not be appropriate because there's a compelling need to do so. And then we also have a new tool that was created called a zoning exception. That is a type of variance that allows a reduction to any number of types of development standards, such as setbacks or height or building placement. This tool has actually not been used yet. Nobody has applied for it. Though we've had one discussion with the homeowner who may be submitting an application next year, but it's there in the toolbox. And then in terms of the designation and rescission process, that was also cleaned up in 2018 to make it a bit more clear of how that process should work. All that said, in the last 4.5 years, there have been some challenges implementing the ordinance. On the top ones, really kind of the unclear permitting requirements, particularly with the structures of merit. The whole idea of the expedited permit process is to allow minor changes to just be approved by staff. And that basically provides very wide and broad discretion to a staff member to look at a proposal and determine whether or not it affects a character defining feature. That's difficult because, one, the term character defining feature is actually not defined. So it's not exactly clear what we're looking at. But also too, it creates a weird result where a planner looks at it and is entirely making a subjective judgment as to if it's okay or not, without really any oversight, due process, public notice, or appeal rights. And then by choosing the process has then made a de facto decision to approve it, because if you decide it's just a building permit, you are in effect approving it. And so that is tricky for us, to say the least. Now, that then results in a challenge in terms of questionable enforcement, because in situations where a building permit submittal has referred to the board as a tier 1 historic resource alteration permit, or any change that's to a landmark or a Alice Avenue property, the code is also a bit unclear than what happens after the board's public hearing. It's clear the board holds a public hearing and provides a recommendation for approval with modifications, or denial. But kind of the second step from there is a bit lacking. Now, for commercial properties, that's fine, because commercial properties already have a very well-defined permit process. So if you need to go to the planning commission, the board is basically recommending to the planning commission and then recommends potentially to the city council. But with single-family properties, the vast majority of single-family properties in the city don't really have a clear permit process in the code that allows for that type of discretionary land use authority. The code makes reference to a table that supposedly should show the decision-making bodies, but it doesn't really take that next step. Ideally, it would very clearly say that the director is the final decision maker, and then this is the process for that decision. So lacking that, there's a reasonable argument to be made that the board's recommendation is really just a glorified offer of advice to staff that cannot necessarily be implemented. Luckily, nobody's really forced the question, and we've done our best to frame the resolutions in such a way that it's defensible if ever came down to it, but it really should be clarified. And then in terms of inconsistent permitting requirements, while it's not atypical to have a kind of a 2-tier permit process for structures of merit versus landmarks, the divergence in Campbell's code is pretty significant. I mean, we arguably, under the former director, he was comfortable allowing additions to be approved by a building permit. The current director is not, so there's some inconsistency there over time because of who's in the director's chair. But it also results in a situation where a lot of work can be done to a structure of merit just through a building permit, whereas if somebody just wants to install a window on a landmark property, it comes to the board. So that's kind of almost feels like you're penalizing people who are landmark or historic district property owners. So we're trying to tighten that up so that it's just a bit more equitable between all forms of HOI property owners. And then when it comes to ordinary maintenance and repair, as noted in the staff report, that definition is very broad. That makes it challenging for staff to properly advise homeowners as to if what they're doing is exempt from the code or if they need some sort of approval, particularly for work that's actually exempt from a building permit. So we want to make sure that moving forward, it's very clear what is and what is not ordinary maintenance and repair. And then lastly, this has come up before in terms of the designation thresholds for really what is a historic property in the city. This is probably pretty critical, not necessarily just to add properties to the list, but to ensure that the properties we have on the list can be maintained on the list so that homeowners who basically want to demolish property don't compel the city to basically be in a position to be forced to remove it because it doesn't actually meet the criteria that we have today, even though these properties may have been added back in 1984. So we're looking at some surgical tweaks to the criteria to be a bit more sensitive to Campbell's heritage. So in terms of recommendations, the permit process is kind of outlined here. We don't want to necessarily recreate the wheel, so we're looking to just kind of build on what the board had recommended in 2018. So the current ordinance has some sense of there's activities that are exempt. That's the ordinary maintenance and repair. So we want to make sure that that's actually very clearly articulated by creating a new exempt category in the code. So it itemizes exempt items so that anybody can just open up the zoning code and see it's exempt. And by exempt, we would literally say that they actually do not need any city approval. They can just do it. Now, this by definition also would mean this is work that is exempt from a building permit. So there's no need to even interface with the city whatsoever. This is fairly nominal work, but it's good just to document it. Then moving into the ministerial range of things. So just the two broad categories of city permitting. You have ministerial actions, which are actions that require no subjective judgment of a staff member. It should be clearly black or white, whether or not it meets or does not the requirements. And that's good for things that are routine, so long as we can articulate them in an objective basis. This kind of has a tie into a lot of the state housing legislation regarding objective standards and trying to make sure things are objective. And that's to make things ministerial so that they can just be made at the staff level without any public process, without appeals. And generally that should be fine because there should be no question about whether or not those items are acceptable or not. Now, currently that process, that's the expedited process that's done through what our code calls a zoning clearance. Zoning clearance is just a very broad term that encapsulates a lot of different activities. If I stamp a set of plans and it's approved, that's a zoning clearance. So to make sure we're kind of more consistent with industry terminology when it comes to historic properties, we're proposing that the zoning clearance terminology be changed to certificate of appropriateness. And so that would be just a ministerial action for very routine work that staff can approve. And this is work that doesn't need to come to the director's attention because it's so benign. Then that takes us into the realm of discretionary applications. So discretionary applications are processes that, because of due process requirements coming out from the United States and state constitutions, require some level of public input and right to appeal and ability to present evidence in support of your case. So we're looking at basically adding a new tier and reclassifying the existing tiers. Right now we have tier 1 and tier 2, and those would be proposed to be reclassified to tier 2 and tier 3 respectively. And we would add a new tier 1. And this new tier 1 would be an administrative action of the director. So much of the routine planning work that comes through our office goes through this administrative decision-making process, which incorporates a 10-day public notification where we literally mail out notices to property owners within 300 feet, letting them know that a decision will be rendered on this project. It includes a map and a description of what's being proposed. Then after those 10 days have concluded, the director will render a decision, issue a document that is the formal decision document, and then that decision becomes final within 10 more days. And so if there's any disagreement from either the applicant or the public, they can make an appeal, and that appeal normally would be considered by the planning commission. However, in circumstances where there may be an appeal here, we would recommend to the council and the board that those appeals first be heard by the board, who would then offer a recommendation to the planning commission, who would have then a decision on that appeal. And then moving to tier 2, which is currently basically tier 1, the board would hold a public hearing, as you currently do now. And then the code would be clarified to clearly indicate that the director would then have final decision-making authority based on the board's recommendation. And we would be looking at a kind of a truncated administrative decision process there, where we would avoid the advanced 10-day notice because anybody interested would have already been noticed of the board's hearing and presumably showed up. So the board would hold a public hearing, make a recommendation. The next day, the director would then issue a notice of decision, generally consistent with the board's recommendation, absent a very unusual circumstance. And then that decision would be final within 10 days unless there's an appeal. If there were an appeal for a tier 2, that would go directly to planning commission because the board would have already opined. And then that leaves tier 3. And that is, again, today's basically tier 2. So that would include any alterations to a structure that are very unusual due to some sort of extreme financial condition, or the property is significantly been damaged, maybe after an earthquake or something, a health, life safety issue, or it's proposed to be relocated or demolished. And also clarifying that for the purposes of demolition, we would also be including basically a reconstruction of a single family home. So the city's local building code has a threshold where if you remove so much of an existing house, it becomes basically a new house, which is a de facto demolition. So we want to make sure that that concept is also tied into this. So it's clear that that would be a type of demolition that would warrant city council approval. Now, should we get to that point and the council approves it, then they would effectively also be removing the property from the HRI. So we would try and tweak that a bit in the code so that they would have some sort of connection, so that we wouldn't have just a kind of a legacy property on the list that's no longer actually historic. That's just more of a cleanup effort. So in terms of the different categories, I've done a breakdown of the spreadsheet. So all these items are numbered per the table that was included in your staff report. We did try to identify them by kind of general categories for easier reading. And this identifies the different tiers of review. So there's not necessarily one right way to do this, other than in the situations where we get into what is an ministerial approval. We just need to make sure that anything that's in the ministerial bucket is very clearly a black and white decision. There really shouldn't be any kind of subjective decision making. So we can just start with this first grouping of items listed as roofing. And this is the staff recommendation. So if there's any disagreements or questions, this would be the time, and we can do straw polls if necessary. Up to board questions, comments. If there are none, that's great. We can move on to the next slide. Right now, it's just on roofing.
So we're going to go through each one of these.
Yeah,
and just get,
yeah.
okay, got it.
Go through each one. Then we're done.
I just have a big picture question. Well, first off is thank you for doing all this work. Like we were talking earlier, very easy to follow and everything. Second is, I'm just curious, was this all developed just on your own with some input from various people, or were these also ideas that came from where you saw from other cities as ideas, et cetera, et cetera? I'm just curious, I'm behind the scenes, Wizard of Oz that you are, how you pull all this together.
This is pretty much me trying to look at some of the past decisions to see kind of what activities the board has been comfortable with, what is possible to prove at the staff level, what may require more review. But this is generally just kind of internal recommendation. Most cities don't really do this, as far as I can tell. Most cities are very consistent with what we currently do, which is very old school. I mean, the state's forcing us to go into a very prescriptive direction, trying to take away a lot of the subjective authority staff members have historically had in planning department. So in that vein, it's probably best that we're doing this. A lot of these housing laws eventually will probably pierce historic properties. So we want to make sure if and when that happens, we're well prepared with a good permitting program.
Okay. Then last question before we get in here is, do you need our input on whether or not the overall format that you're recommending is appropriate in terms of the exempt certificate of appropriateness, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, or are we really going towards just the categories of items and whether or not they're in their correct?
No, we
Category.
can certainly discuss the overall framework. That's up for grabs
I
as well.
personally don't have any, I like what you're proposing as the overall permit process. And maybe as we go through it, we might see something, we go, oh, wait, maybe it's a little bit, but from an overall picture, I think it all makes sense. And like I said, it's trying to follow what we already have in place and not making it a whole new arrangement that people will get confused because they're looking at something old versus new and everything.
Yeah, I would also add to that. I mean, this could also be seen as iterative. I mean, over time, we can have deeper discussions later about specific types of materials that may be appropriate and even specific types of styles of buildings, so that this list can be refined in the future. The board can recommend to the council just, kind of very focused code amendments so that more work can just be done more quickly and it can be more specific. So it doesn't necessarily always have to be subject to a discretionary process.
So just a clarification on this. So really, to me, the dividing line is between 1 and 2. Because the certificate of appropriateness, right, that's staff, and tier 1 is the director. But it's not like we have hundreds of people in this office, right, that are working on this. So basically, to me, those two are very similar. It's just an official director decision versus staff to say, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, the tier 1 provides more decision-making authority to the director to either say no. That's the thing with the certificate of appropriateness. I mean, if you meet the letter of the law, you have to say yes. And because of that, we're not really even referring to the design guidelines or the Secretary of Interior standards. It's just looking at what the code says. With the tier 1, that's where it gets a bit more subjective. We are opening up the design guidelines and the Secretary of Interior standards. And, if it's something that's just outlandish, we can deny it. If it's something that can be approved with minor tweaks, we can approve it subject to some revisions that provides more leverage where necessary. But again, relatively minor. And, as noted in the staff report, we did try to focus on non-street visible items being something that could be more approvable under tier 1, and items that start to affect street facing components of the building start to go to the board.
Thank you. Let's see. I think you've done a phenomenal job.
Thank you.
You very carefully tweaked and clarified issues that we've been dealing with for a number of years, because I've been on the board so long. So I'm stunned at your work. I mean, it's brilliant. Your staff recommendations are clear. You've clarified issues of ambiguity that needed to get clarified for a long time. I have no issues with the scope of work pages that you've shown. I have one question under a scope of work, site features and accessory buildings, and that is, would it be a good idea to include solar panels in that?
It's maybe, well, I guess that's true, that solar panels are actually under roofing because they're typically on the rooftop.
Yeah.
So we did
It would
incorporate that.
be exempt, I guess.
Well, we did incorporate anything that's exempt really is something that doesn't even require a building permit at all. So even if it's nominal and a building permit's required where a planner needs to actually look at it, then a certificate of appropriateness is probably the best tool. And that's what's actually recommended here under number 5.
Okay.
And I mean, as the board is probably aware, I think Cindy maybe have discussed this
okay.
with you some years ago. I mean, the state legislation regarding solar panel systems, PVs, is very stringent against the city. So we pretty much have to approve it in all circumstances, but we don't have to allow a system to damage a building. And so we want to make sure that just as part of a planner's review, that the roofing structure is not being adversely impacted by the system. And that would be the tool that we would do that. Now, I think there may be some recent state legislation that may actually complicate number 5, but we'll still need to look into that a bit.
Thank you.
I echo what everybody's been saying about complimenting you. I mean, this is very thorough. This is Herculean in its efforts. So thank you for doing this. I just have a question really around nomenclature and just to make sure I understand. Well, so exempt means go ahead and do it. I mean, it's a freebie.
Correct. You don't even need to come to the city.
Right. And it just the terms, the term certificate of appropriateness, would you essentially say, so that's below a tier 1, but it's basically, is there literally a certificate saying this is appropriate and who issues it? And
Pretty much. So the idea there would be probably probably like a 1-page document that would literally be titled certificate of appropriateness and indicate the applicant, owner, the scope of work, reference the plan that had been submitted, and just basically says, based on the review per this code section, the director does find that this work as incorporated in Exhibit A, which would be the plans that the applicant submitted, is appropriate and consistent with the historic preservation chapter, done, approved. And this way you have a piece of paper, a little piece, well, not a little, but electronic piece of paper that says what you proposed has been approved by the city and it's okay.
De facto approved based on.
Correct. Now, and that's going to be a lot of different things, generally also things that require building permits, but that's different from the exempt. The exempt is something that's so nominal. The homeowner can just open up the code, see that, okay, yeah, I clearly am exempt. I don't even need to talk to the city. The city will not issue me any piece of paper. There's not a need for an approval document.
Right.
And a lot of that is already basically just things that are generally exempt for all homeowners. We just want to make sure that we're documenting that those exemptions also apply to historic homeowners. Like we haven't got to like, if I want to build a standard fence, I want to make sure it's clear that just building a standard fence, even on historic property, is exempt. You do not need city approval to do it just because it's historic. And we want to make sure it's clear because I mean, I'm not going to be here forever. Everybody at some point leaves. So better with the code, the more clear that code is, the more consistent it can be applied over time.
Right. And then another way to look at it is exempt is basically tier 0. You know, if we're talking about complexity,
I do like
you know,
these.
certificate of appropriateness, you know, tier 0.5, and then it goes from there.
Yeah, I mean, if you notice that the certificate of appropriateness and the 3 tiers are actually under permit processes because there's actually a permit
Mhm.
process associated with it. Whereas exempt is basically outside of the permit process because it's literally exempt.
Gotcha. Okay. And I think this sets us up well for, stay tuned for next meeting when we start talking about Mills Act things. You know, because we may be talking about, per the mayor's suggestion at the city council meeting we presented at, is to kind of tie Mills Act eligibility to what requires, you know, permitting and work on the historic preservation front. This really lays it out much more specifically. Right. You know, the example of the, you know, the new toilet seat versus, you know, doing major construction.
Yeah, and we haven't gotten there yet, but for instance, interior remodel work, that would be exempt because even though a building permit is required to remodel your kitchen, a planner doesn't actually look at interior remodel because planners really focus on the use of properties, the site layout, and the exteriors of buildings. Planners do not look at, generally as a general rule, not always, but generally as a general rule, at the interior configuration. It's not what we do. That's something that the building department does. So those types of interior remodels will never even come across our desk. And because of that, those would be classified as exempt because they're not being looked at by a staff planner. So to that point, yeah, I think what Mayor Resnikoff had indicated, yes, I mean, work that's basically just anybody would normally do a kitchen remodel, for instance, that would be exempt activity, and that would be perhaps an argument for something that would not qualify as a work plan item.
And this provides us, along with the spreadsheet, attachment 3, with the detail to really codify that.
Correct.
And then as far as the details of attachment 3, we'll go through that later. We don't need to, I mean, later tonight. Now is not the time to bring up questions about this.
Well, no, so basic on screens, this is broken down into pieces. So every single category has its own slide. So right now we're on roofing. So if there's any particular questions or disagreements about any of the roofing categories, we can ferret those out now. If not, we can move on to windows, doors, awnings, and shutters.
I have 2 questions on this one. I'm going to jump in here.
Okay.
One is on the comment about the interior for permitting for the interior. Again, we're talking about permitting from the HRI HBB component. So if someone comes in and says, I'm doing a roof, blah, 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 goes through this process, but they also will be doing a permit simultaneously or a separate one for anything related to building that's not under our purview, correct? I want to make sure I heard you say
Yeah,
that's
so-
something exempt, but it's exempt from the planning side, but it's still required under the building permit side.
Correct.
So
So
I just
there
want to
are,
make sure everyone on the board
Correct.
understands that this is not exempt from everything. It's
Right.
exempt from our component. Building department still has theirs, public works still has theirs, fire department, police, et cetera, whatever requirements for them, they would still have their requirements along the way.
yes, I mean, there are some things that don't require anybody's approval. But then there are some things that may require only building, but not planning. So for the purposes of this, yes, that's a good point.
Okay.
That exempt means not subject to any historic review by the city planning division.
Right, okay. And then in terms of the roofing, question I have is just on the PV panels, it's under certificate of appropriateness. But I'm asking everybody under item 4, alteration to building roof line or what, no, new roofing, different material, that's a tier 1. PV is a different roofing material in a sense. So should that not be a tier 1? Because it's a pretty significant change of the roof.
I
Design
absolutely
center?
agree, but state law does not.
Oh, so really,
So-
so state law says it has to be underneath that.
So
Oh.
state law requires all PV systems, even historic properties, to be a ministerial action. So the best we can
Oh.
do is a certificate of appropriateness, not even to really evaluate the system itself or its size, but just to ensure that it's not damaging the roof system. I mean, obviously, this is probably more of an issue with tile roofs.
So from a building standpoint, would they then have different review? Because they would be looking at the structure to see that they can support the weight and everything, right?
Yeah, so yes, like anything, it goes through the city's permitting system and then the review branches out.
Got
So everybody
Okay.
looks at their own subject matter expertise areas. So the building department looks at one thing, planning looks at something else.
I'm personally good with everything else in that section.
And of course, PV stands for.
Photovoltaic
Solar panels.
solar panels.
The document
Fair.
is really well done, and I really appreciate it as a person who would like to walk into the office and have this handed to me or my contractor, so that I don't have to like agonize over all the rest of the stuff that usually gets agonized over.
Me too.
So I am looking at this as a document that would be handed out to me or to my contractor. And I'd actually like to see something that defines what the city thinks historic preservation is, because so many people think that you can't touch your toilet or your bathroom or your kitchen. They don't know that. So if there was a simple description that this is a historic preservation document of expectations that separates it from the other things that will be, licenses and planning documents, things that are needed, just separates it as what the historic preservation in the city expects.
Yeah, and that's, that's our goal as well,
Yeah.
to provide a lot more clarity, because the hard part with the current process is that probably, really when it comes to structures of merit, the answer almost always is, it depends.
Yeah.
And it depends on what, do I personally think it's okay? And if I'm not sure, then I need to check with the director. And then that's where it just gets our personal judgments get involved. And
That's too scary for
It
someone that's
absolutely
willing
is.
to spend money, so.
again, and this is where, I mean, particularly with the example of additions, former director was okay with additions just as building permits. Current director is not. I mean, that's the type of discrepancy between directors that really should not exist in the code.
And before we go down to more details of the spreadsheet, just a general question. And no, I'm not getting defensive about job security here and, keeping us busy. But it does seem like a number of the items that we've gone over this year would fall into tier 1. Which would kind of, be the director at the director's discretion. So if we had a year next year that had the same types of cases as this past year, we'd actually be reviewing fewer things.
That is true. I mean, over time, particularly as a list like this is refined and we can get into more very specific material choices based on different types of styles, there absolutely will be less work for the board to do in time.
Yeah, I know.
So yes, and then there are other things that,
Yeah, and I think the trade-off, though, and we've talked about this, is that people who come to us, it can add 6 months to their process of doing something. And so I think what I like about this is it really defines, right? If you do it this way, which frankly, this is pushing towards replacing it with the like materials, doing it in the same shape and size, doing the roof the same. Hey, then you've got a fast pass. And if you really want to change it all, then you've got to go to the board, which to me is like the right fork in the road.
It would be nice if we were notified of it, if it's on the list though, because sometimes, you just do drive-bys and you might see something that, you can't be all eyes in here. So.
and that's something we can easily
Yeah,
do. I mean, we can just copy the
Just a
board in any.
notification of what's going through historic preservation.
And,
So in a
and I would
sense-
also point out too that building permit applications never find their way into the DRC agenda. So you all see the DRC agenda that was released today a bit late. So you would actually see applications for all of these certificate, well, not the exempt, but certificate of appropriateness up and up would be planning applications that would be on the DRC. They probably really wouldn't warrant any actual staff discussion, but we also use that as a disclosure tool for the general public and the boards and commissions.
I do have a story to relate. I was working on preservation in Los Gatos way back when, and there was a house on Johnson Avenue that was too close to the street. And no one in the city realized what that was until it was torn down, and that's because it was the toll booth for going over the mountain. So it is really good. You never know what somebody knows when you're making a decision, and it might be nice to be, you know, if there were more ears on it, just for the extra information.
May I ask a related question? I'm going to say this wrong. The Development Review Committee agenda. The Downtown Neighborhood Association gets it as a courtesy. Are we not supposed to get it?
No, all the boards and commissions receive it,
Yeah.
as well as
I
all the
didn't- I
neighborhood
didn't get it.
associations.
I didn't get it this week.
I mean, it went out
But
late
my
today.
husband did, which is the only reason I know that Mike folks' stuff is coming up. So I don't know, maybe it was just.
It wasn't on your
oversight.
city email?
Mhm.
Okay, I'll check on that.
Okay. At least I didn't see it. I was
All
getting
right.
ready to leave.
Any
until
other
you said-
either general questions or anything on the roofing?
No.
Because I think we've got a lot of these to go over.
Okay.
Want to make sure we get it all, but I think, sounds like we're all okay on the roofing.
Yes.
I just have another big picture question is when we were doing the 3 Mills Acts last year or the year before, we came up with that list that we used to identify what what items we were going to allow for the funding and everything. Are any of those either added to his or removed from this list that we have here now? Do you
I
recall?
mean, those are distinct things. the list of items here was done with the purpose of identifying permit process. That's a little different than identifying appropriateness for a Mills Act contract. I mean, there can certainly be some synergy to Board Member Cordaway's point, which might be beneficial. But I mean, that'll be January's discussion. I mean, that would be a big thing if, you know, really what work really warrants a contract, because clearly the council, at least as constituted previously, was of the opinion that those contracts should be really focused on properties that really need certain levels of work.
I didn't have anything on windows, doors, awning, shutters, FYI, if that helps the process out.
I didn't either.
One question on it, and I think you did a great, I know, so it starts with one, yeah. So I appreciate the fact that you really have it focused on what's street facing versus non-street facing, and I think you've divided up pretty well. I guess the one that I was, just because we've seen this come to this board before, and so it may be just in the definition of different material or style, but number 7, right, replacement of street, I don't care about the non-street facing at all, but the street facing within the opening, but it could be a totally different material or style. And since I've seen a lot of debate with this board on those items where people want to change, it's the same space, but they really want to change what it looks like. So that's just a question of, for me, I guess the question for people's comment is should that be all tier 1, no matter what material style you want to do, street facing, or is there some, do we want to parse out a little bit? So non-street facing, have at it, street facing.
Tier 2.
Yeah, well, I'm all for not making people have to spend all this time waiting for us to approve something if it really does fit, and the director can kind of look at that and make that decision right away versus waiting a month for our meeting or 2 months,
I mean, that's,
I just worry about the cases where, I guess really it comes down to the director knows what fits within the historic code and not, and he or she can just make that determination.
Yeah, I actually did struggle with this one a bit because there's an argument that in some ways we're almost penalizing people who want to do something beneficial. Say you have an old vinyl window and I want to do a new wood window. Well, technically that's actually a different material. So now that actually has to go through a tier 1 permit. I mean, could we say that all wood windows are certificate of appropriateness? I mean, maybe. I mean, well, building department has made the call that all windows actually require building permit, which is a little different than how the actual building code reads, but so, and because of that, then that would come our way. So it needs to at least be a certificate of appropriateness. But that's a good example of how there's not really like one right way of doing this. I mean, you can just keep parsing these things, just finer and finer grain, you know, on a Spanish style house, a window of this particular material, this particular whatever profile is a certificate of appropriateness. I mean, and over time, we can actually refine that. That's what I was kind of referring to, that this list can be iterative. I mean, over time, we can just kind of develop more and more specific types of things that are okay to do versus things that require a little more review.
Well, I mean, I think that's helpful. And so I withdraw my question. I think that.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And that's certainly
But
something.
If it's as easy to read as this is for someone, the more we can define it in a simple format. So somebody can sit at home and go, I can do this, I can, you know, and kind of get a really good idea of what they can do.
Yeah, I mean,
Stressing about it.
yeah, I mean, my concern was that, again, with a certificate of appropriateness, it's really just an up or down thing. You either comply or you don't. So I guess for me, there are kind of the unknown unknowns of situations where even a wood window may not necessarily make the most sense if there's other circumstances that maybe require more review. I don't know, maybe it's a house that actually has metal windows. I don't know, but unfortunately, just where there are areas that we kind of lack some full knowledge, then at least the discretionary mechanism of a tiered permit allows us our ability to have a better analysis on a case-by-case basis.
We are coming into mid-century modern being eligible for adding to our list, you know.
Yes,
As the years tick by, we need to look for the next group.
correct. And so we don't necessarily want to create thresholds that are necessarily overly broad.
Right.
That may not be appropriate for all types of homes.
It did stand out to me, it's not to belabor the point, but there did seem to be sort of a separation made in some areas under windows, doors, awnings, oh my, you know, about non-street facing versus street facing. And isn't it sort of, is it kind of surface level to have different requirements for whether it's street facing or not, because it's still the same structure? I mean, just to keep the integrity, wouldn't it stand to reason that whether it's in the backyard and the side or the front, it should be treated the same?
That's certainly a judgment call. The recommendation does take that kind of binary system because the design guidelines do have some reference to things that are facing the street versus things that don't, particularly with windows in terms of like materials. But that's a paradigm that the board doesn't have to accept. That's just the recommendation. I mean, if it can be consolidated, if that breaking down between non-street and street facing is not something the board supports.
And but just so you know, Rob, that's something that since I've been on the board has been a consistent thing for Campbell, is that if you can see, and literally we'll look at from street view of the house, and if you can see it from the side or the front from the sidewalk, we have a very different set of criteria than in the back. So if somebody's doing an ADU in the back or something that can't be seen at all, we've had much different leeway with that.
It's the visual historic facade of the house that is most critical, that you walk down the street and it looks like it did, you know, whenever it was built.
Yeah, I just wanted to point that out and let my more experienced president, you know, compare that to historic.
And to that end, I mean, it's also why additions to the rear of homes are seen more favorably than additions to the front or sides. And I would just point out to, there's one kind of outline, exception to a lot of the general rule here is if you're making new openings or if you're making new openings or removing existing features, that generally would go to the board. An exception is number 15 in terms of aluminum window awnings. A lot of those kind of just tacked on, screwed on awnings are actually, those are exempt from building code, building permit requirements, and pretty much all of those were just literally just put on in the 50s. So they're not really original.
Yeah, one of the people that got the Mills Act on Alice Avenue wants to get rid of those awnings.
Yeah.
But they were put on, I don't know, in the 60s or something, and they're not
Exactly.
originally. He goes, can I
Exactly.
take them off? And I said, I hope so. Why don't you check with Terry?
Exactly. So that's one of those kind of an exception of something we really don't want to stand in the way of people doing. I mean, they don't need a permit to do it, just kind of a couple of bolts. They can just take it off, and we just
Yeah.
want to make clear that they can just do
Never
that.
mind.
Yeah.
But in 20 years, we might say they're historic.
Well, they were never original, and they were never installed in a way that it was ever really cognizant of the historic status of the building. So maybe, but likely
There's
not.
always going to be an exception to the rule.
Yeah.
And what did you say? The unknown unknowns.
Yeah.
When we moved into our house, somebody put aluminum windows. They took out the original beautiful wooden windows and they put in aluminum windows on the side that were not very well done. And it was very drafty. And so we came to the city. This is before we were a landmark. We came to the city and we said, we really would like to take those out and this is what we'd like to put in so that it matches the windows in the front. And they were like, well, yeah. So it wasn't a big deal.
Exactly. And again, I mean, with enough time, we can start writing things like that, you can remove and replace existing windows in a material that's, found in 60% or more of the existing windows. So you try to make sure that you create more consistency. So, but yeah, I mean, there's only so much we can do at this initial push. But again, can be there's an ongoing work plan on it.
Yeah.
So it sounds like everyone's okay with windows, doors, awnings, and shutters?
Yes.
All right, let's move on to wall cladding.
Okay, so wall cladding. This is fairly clear. We're starting to get into a situation where you have changes to stucco that are beyond just minor fixes and starting to really get into a situation, like, unfortunately, Mr. Key, where you restucco a house, but stucco is not just stucco. I mean, you can dramatically change the appearance of a house depending on the texture of the stucco and its particular application. And the more of it that you do, the greater likelihood that you could adversely affect the home. So, and ideally, that's not really something that should be done, but if there's a really need to do it, we want to make sure that's at least captured in a tier 1 permit where it's more than 20% of the wall area, even if it's like for like, if just a document is in fact like for like. So that would require a planner to go out to the house, look at the stucco, probably with the building inspector, document what it is, and then work with the homeowner and their contractor to ensure whatever new stucco is going on actually is in fact appropriate. And, that would be the approval. We can really document that, yes, maybe the stucco is all falling apart, but at least a new stucco would be visually consistent with the existing. And then trying to be less regulatory, where it's less than 20% of the wall area, and that's more of a repair job, focusing just on that smaller area that's consistent with the rest of the house, so that 80% is still original. And this way we can minimize, it's a balancing act. I mean, 20% is a bit arbitrary, to be quite frank, but there's probably arguments that's too high or too low, but kind of where we landed.
I personally have no issues on this section.
This does open us up, though. For example, if there's a non-masonry, non-stucco exterior without, but with exempt status, somebody could paint their historically significant home hot pink.
So that's actually an interesting question or comment, because it's not entirely clear to me to what extent paint is actually governed by our current code. I don't think it is either. I mean, maybe with landmarks and historic district properties, because there's the more clarity about what that means to be a material change, but we've never really applied it like that. So
Some people might love it.
it is, well, yes, there are lots of things.
There are places that do have those, but they're very specific. Though.
Yes, and some cities actually will basically regulate paint, but only to the extent that you have to use an historic paint palette from one of the major paint companies. But Campbell's never really been that heavy-handed with paint. It's not clear to me, again, in the code. Previous version certainly did not do that. Neither did my predecessor. So for that reason, we're just kind of documenting for the record that painting, other than a couple of exceptions, is in fact exempt. Now, this actually does provide a little more protection, though, because currently, because it's exempt, arguably you're not really violating anything if you paint historic brick, which is probably a problem, because you don't want someone to do that, because that is a pretty important feature of a house.
I would write in there, though, that paint destroys the ability of that brick to survive an earthquake. So
Hmm.
I would get the specifics on that, because you should not paint brick
Yeah,
for
yeah.
that reason.
And we would
It's
have,
not- If it's structural
Yeah.
on a building.
it's unlikely we would ever approve it. I mean, a lot of times, even if there's a situation where generally 99% of the times we would deny requests, we still need to have a process that people can avail themselves of. If just to, petition the government to do something, get an answer, appeal it, and then eventually be heard by their council, their elected officials. And so lots of these things probably would never really be approved, but there is at least a mechanism for those people to have, again, that due process right. And that would be an example of painting brick. That's not something we would want to do and probably would almost always deny it. But for some reason, there's some unusual circumstance, then the council can, do what it finds appropriate. Now, here, the exception, though, would be unpainted masonry surface. So if you do have an existing brick wall that had been painted 50 years ago, this would allow that to be repainted. I mean, again, that's a judgment call. I mean, we can say that all brick, it doesn't matter if it's painted or not, can never be painted again.
And there's smaller print in here that disallows earthquakes from happening.
Oh, it does,
Yeah,
thank
so
you.
Daniel worked that in, he has that power, so.
So one question, just because I think it's probably in here under something else, or it's just maybe it's under architectural elements. So we're all talking about repair or replacement, but if you have, well, and we're all talking about like for like, but if you were replacing siding that's not like for like, that's not governed by the wall cladding, it's governed by someplace else.
So that would be number 23. So new replacement wall cladding
Oh, I see.
material.
Okay, with the new material, got it, sorry.
So then in parentheses, so that would include a variation. So if you
Got it,
have
got it.
existing
Okay,
siding.
I missed that. Yeah,
Yeah.
got it. Okay, thank you.
And that's important because, I mean, even if you have a house that siding, if it's a different profile, then that can dramatically change the appearance. And that could be okay because maybe the siding that's currently there is not original. And maybe they're trying to restore back to the original profile that they have from a photograph from 80 years ago. And that would be, that would be something that would be considered by the board.
I do think all of the unreinforced masonry buildings in this town have made it up to code since that 89 earthquake. I know it was, slow in coming, but I think they all got. completed.
Yes, correct. I believe,
Yes, I know, but some pushed it out till the bitter end.
correct. And some cities are not fully compliant yet.
Right.
Yeah, I was in
Exactly.
Petaluma a few weeks ago and there was a building that had a very obvious sign about it being an unreinforced masonry building. I was actually surprised to see that.
Yeah.
It was still open to the public, oddly enough, but
Oh,
yes, my understanding from the former building officials that before he retired, I mean, he got every single building done.
I do remember hearing this.
Okay, so I think we're good on cladding. So moving on to architectural elements.
Okay, I have just in case there's any further questions, just on the 18, just for clarification, the whole idea of texture coating. So that's a type of painting that has aggregate in the paint. So that can give the paint have a texture. So that's, I mean, it's technically painting. It's not stuccoing, you don't have a whole lath and wire. So you don't actually need a building permit for it. But if you do it, it actually looks like you could have stuccoed the house. So I checked with our building department that technically does not need a permit. So we want to make sure we covered that and clearly say that that's not covered under just a painting, even though it is paint. All right. I think it's just to architectural elements. So it starts to get into porches, patios, balconies, chimneys. Again, removing or altering those original features is pretty important, or adding them also is pretty important because that can kind of make a significant change to a home. So a lot of that's going to be covered under a tier 2 permit reviewed by the board when it's street facing, but again, with a theme of non-street facing, trying to look at those things just through a tier 1 permit. But certainly these items are of significance enough that they should all be subject to some level of discretionary review and not really would ever be ministerial.
So one question on this. So this is about removal or adding things. But let's say you have a chimney that's falling apart and you want to rebuild it, right? As it was with the same, or you have to rebuild it because fire code requires it to be higher than the original one. Where would that fit?
Well, I suppose if you were rebuilding it, that basically means you're removing it, reconstructing it in place, but that would be removal and new construction. So that would probably be tier 2. I mean, we could look, I mean, if it's a like for like reconstruction, I mean, that could be an additional line item. That could be something perhaps even.
Well, would that be under additions, demolitions and other? If you're talking about if there's no chimney and you're adding one?
No. So you have a chimney
Right, and you got to repair it. replace it
and
or whatever.
it's basically in danger of collapsing. So you need to get it fixed. And the current fire code, it's too short.
Right.
So you'd have to raise it. So it's now going to have a different profile.
That'd be number 24. Removal or alteration of existing and chimneys.
And it's under tier 2.
Except I'd look at a removal is different.
Or
than a-
alteration.
Right, but if the alteration is being forced by the city,
Mhm.
right, you don't want it, you want to just replace it.
Right.
The city says you can't replace it because of fire code.
It's considered an alteration.
Yeah, I just don't know that's an alteration being forced by the city. The
Is
homeowner does not want to alter it. The city is forcing them. I don't think that homeowner should have to wait.
The
Several
question
months to come
is
here.
it dangerous?
Well,
I
if it-
think that's.
Right, no, his point is that because it's a city requirement, we're putting it under tier 2, which means it's going to take longer to get it versus being in tier 1.
It's kind of like hand railings that aren't the height that they're supposed to be.
Right.
They're the state board rules take precedence on residential, but they don't on commercial unless it's changed.
I mean, I would say something like that, even where you have a situation where the law is compelling you to do something, there's not necessarily always one way to do that. I mean, for instance, with ADA accessibility, I mean, a lot of older buildings are not ADA compliant. So oftentimes we'll see permit applications for all sorts of ramps and switchbacks, and you're saying, well, I have to do it. And while it's true, they do need to provide access. Oftentimes the planners will say, well, is there a better way to do it? Can you maybe take access from the back, or can you change the finished floor in some ways to bridge the gap? And so there can be kind of an iterative process there that can achieve a better result. So in this type of circumstance, yes, I mean, you may, if you have to remove your chimney and rebuild it, I'm not sure it's going to be objective enough of what the final result will look like. I mean, how do you build something identical that by definition is actually not identical, because it has to be bigger, which means to me that requires some level of subjective review, because now, well, how big is big enough? Is it just height? Is it width? What's the material? Does the whole thing need to be exactly the same material? Or is there, I mean, you start to have all these questions because it's not, I mean, life is not black and white, of course. There's a lot of subjective aspects to these things. So it probably can never be a certificate of appropriateness, because again, that's black and white. But I can see the chair's argument that perhaps it should be at tier 1.
Well, yeah, I mean, for me, again, I'm thinking about, some of the applicants we've seen. I'm thinking about, experience that I've had in an old house in Piedmont. And basically, the city wants you to fix your chimney so it doesn't collapse in an earthquake. You don't want to spend money on that. Your chimney's fine. You're fine with it. And so my worry here is, let's say you're redoing your roof. Your contractor says you need to fix that chimney because it's an earthquake, it's coming down. And you say, I need that roof done now. I'm not going to, if I go through this board, I'm going to be in the middle of winter. and it's gonna be raining and I don't want to have my roof off, so I'm just gonna leave the chimney and take the risk, which I think a lot of people do. So I just, that, again, I look at removal like, hey, we don't use our fireplace. We just want to, we're re-roofing, we want to take the chimney off because it's just an ornamental piece now. I can see that as requiring coming to this board because you really are altering it for, you know, your own whatever efficiency. You don't like it there. Right. Versus you're actually being told it's a life safety issue and we're basically encouraging you not to do it. Because the rest of the project, right, to re-roof, right, you're up here with like for like, it's just a certificate of appropriateness. And then suddenly your chimney is now at 2 levels above that.
We're trying to avoid a situation where the city is requiring that you do
Right.
X to the chimney, but
Right.
then is asking that you get permission to do it.
Is there something in the state guidelines of restoration about chimneys? I think we should look at that and see if they have something. Because if you want the house to look as it looks historically, it should be what it was. Unless there's a really good reason, why not?
Yes, and we might run into this with, I'm not sure how many historic properties have balconies, but I mean, some of those balconies may need to be, you know, retrofitted after the Berkeley accident. I mean, we could parse number 24 into basically to kind of create a narrow exception to the general rule that reconstruction of an existing feature is a tier 1.
Yeah, I mean, my thought, tier 1, you're still having review, you still have to go to the, it just doesn't, you don't have to wait for us.
Yes.
And on that, I think that's going to be fairly clear. What is a life safety replacement that's kind of being forced upon you, and what is I want to have a crazy chimney that the city's going to say, no, you need to go through HPB review because we're not going to let you take out your brick chimney and put some type of smokestack or something.
Okay, so I would offer then, I mean, we could basically create a kind of a sub number 24 that allows for reconstruction of an existing architectural element for life safety reasons as a tier 1. It's kind of just a relatively narrow exception. And a lot of this is going to come down to I mean, right now, in a lot of ways, I know it doesn't feel like it, but this is still actually relatively high level. The devil will be in the details of the actual draft ordinance. But the more specific we can get, like, I mean, the term life safety is pretty good because it really identifies the purpose for the alteration and that it's really just it's a reconstruction work. So we can certainly do something like that if the board is supportive.
Okay, any other thoughts on architectural elements?
So is that
Yeah.
unanimous consent that?
Yes.
Okay.
All right, moving on to additions, demolitions, and other.
Okay.
I have no issues on this one, just FYI.
Agreed. No issues.
Okay, I think we're good.
Okay.
Looks like everything except interior comes to us, so.
One way or the other.
But you could send it to me.
Yeah, some of these may be a little strange, particularly with number 34. So there may be circumstances where you actually see a permit come through, it gets denied, and then it gets appealed and denied, and then comes back to tier 3, and then they make it kind of a different case. So but hopefully that will be relatively rare. We've never seen any requests like that yet.
And with 35 being the single exempt one, I mean, you could literally turn your home into an indoor pool. I mean,
Yes.
I mean, effectively,
Yeah, as long
Well,
as the facade
as long as it looks
like
okay.
Right. A little steamy.
But
There you
yeah,
go.
remember, it's got to go through the building department and other
Yeah.
ones too. So if the code does not allow a pool inside your kitchen, then they can't do a pool. So they still have to follow
Right.
those requirements. We're only talking about the exterior.
Fair. And I do think that that's helpful for, you know, as we look at the Mills Act requirements, because this could possibly, you know, any interior improvement. Right? Remember the mayor was talking about how, well, you know, would that really qualify? And this gives teeth to not claiming those expenses as Mills Act expenses. So there's a ramification of this, which I think is where we want to be headed.
Yeah, and we'll, as part of the actual draft ordinance, we also need to give some thought of what we mean by not affecting outward appearance. So for instance, I believe the Growers National Bank, or you have Level Up. I mean, that second floor was kind of shoved in there. It's not original, so you can actually see the floor plate from the exterior windows. Yeah, stuff like that. That's going to be kind of a question for the board. Is that impacting the outward appearance, things you can see through windows? If someone constructs a new stairway that partially obstructs a window, was that just an exterior change? And that'll be, we'll get into that more next year. But those are really the level of details that we need to have a lot more specifics on. Okay. And that takes us to site features and accessory buildings. So internally, we had some discussion a few years ago after the ordinance was adopted to really what extent the historic preservation ordinance applies to the building proper or the overall site. It's a little unclear. You probably the kind of in between answer is probably the best one. That what's historic is kind of what's outlined in the DPR form. So generally, that's going to be the house, unless there are circumstances where you have some site improvements that are very atypical and historic, like the tennis court on the 140 Peters property, the first tennis court in the county. Arguably, that's an historic feature that probably would be subject to some level of review if I want to remove it, but that's going to be fairly rare. So in most cases, you're going to have landscaping, hardscape exempt. Unfortunately, that number 4 was intended to be a footnote, but the formatting got messed up. And that way we would carve out, again, some exceptions to site features that were identified in a DPR form as historic, but otherwise, most of these things we would generally want as a rule to treat historic properties in this area the same that we treat other properties. So, these walls, fences, standard heights are all exempt, except those that physically connect to the house. Unfortunately, again, like Mr. Keys's property, we're connected the wall to a house. Even if the wall were exempt, connecting it to the house to create like a courtyard, that's a material change. And so that would be an exemption to the general rule. And that would have to probably come, I forget where we left that one. That would be, it would be a tier 1 or maybe a tier 2 change. But generally, those types of features would overall be exempt. We also didn't want to pull in ADUs and accessory structures. So there's some need to ensure that like an ADU that's created from a garage is the garage door. Our code for generally ADUs, you need to remove the garage door and replace it with suitable architectural features that are consistent with the house. So what that is, should at least go through a certificate of appropriateness. We're probably going to need to tighten up kind of the design language, because I think right now it's probably a little too subjective. Well, that'll be something we work on. And then similarly with detached accessory structures. So if it's less than 120 square feet, it's actually exempt from the building code. So it's not subject to any zoning requirements. So we'll kind of honor that with historic buildings. Now, if it's over 120 square feet, the zoning code for all types of buildings, all types of properties, actually does indicate that that accessory structure needs to maintain architectural consistency with the house. It doesn't really say how you accomplish that. Yeah, so we'll need to be, yes, but again, not objective. So with historic properties, that's, again, something that applies generally. So we want to make sure these with historic properties that we're capturing that under certificate of appropriateness, and probably we'll want to add some additional design language that at least says what we mean by architecturally consistent.
Okay, so the design guidelines, I think what they were done in 2005, they actually give specific examples of the things that this particular style, let's just say it's a Tudor. And these are the features that make it stand out as that type of architect. So if the person was going to do an ADU that had, or a garage transformation into an ADU that had street facing, you'd want to try to carry over that architectural feature. But
Now, one thing to note on ADUs, however, is that the legislature has adopted annual rounds of legislation on ADUs for, I think, the last 6 years. The law is creating a new conception of what the state calls an exempt ADU, basically exempt from nearly any standard, including they can be front yards with no setbacks at the front. And unfortunately, that actually does apply to historic properties. So yeah, it's unfortunate they did not provide an exemption for that. So even though we do have some design guidelines or design standards for ADUs on historic properties, city attorney has made it clear that anything that's less than 800 square feet, under 18 feet in height, pretty much can be anywhere on the property and look like anything, even on historic properties.
Yeah, and as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, but because I'm seeing that in other jurisdictions, is that if you want to build an addition to your house and your house is historic, you just say it's an attached ADU, and then the state law basically ties the hands of the cities to change it. And then, of course, you just, after it's built and approved, and then you just make a few modifications and you've got a new family.
For the time being, city attorney has been okay with us having in our current ordinance. I don't know if he's going to be okay with this still, but currently we actually do not allow attached ADUs on historic properties specifically to avoid that. Not sure how long that's going to be tenable, but for now it is. We'll see what he thinks. So we're still digesting numerous laws that were adopted last session. We'll double check to see if there's anything that specifically deals with that, but so far we haven't heard anything. But that's how we've approached that currently.
Time to contact your legislator and see for a definition change.
Yeah.
Not sure they care.
Yeah, good luck.
A wall under 4 feet tall that's not connected to the main structure.
Sure.
How would that ever be a thing?
So some people just have walls, fences just around their property. So 4 feet and 6, well, 4 feet is actually the building code threshold for a permit. So that's why it's exempt. And then 6 feet is less than the threshold for a permit, which is 7 feet, but the city's maximum height is 6 feet. So combine those two things, you basically do not need any building or planning approval, so they're exempt. Again, just provided you're not physically connecting the wall to the house, and we're talking about wall, so you can connect your fence to the house, but that's different than a wall. Yeah. 4 feet tall, that's the maximum. Anything taller than 4 feet will require a building permit, and then that starts to get into a tier 1 or tier 2 permit, depending on what you're doing.
A question just on the 43, the larger accessory structure. I notice here we don't have a difference between visible and non-visible from the street. I'm just wondering if that's something we should. It's just certificate of appropriateness, I guess. So I guess it's not a high bar, but.
So the reason for that is that the city's code actually requires that accessory structures be located behind the house in the rear half of the lot. So pretty much by definition, they're not ever going to be visible. Or in a corner lot, they may be visible, but really only above the fence line. So it's nominal enough that it probably doesn't warrant any further review.
Got it. No, that's
Again,
helpful.
this is also a balancing act of not trying to impose a permit process that far exceeds that of a non-historic property.
Right. Yeah, no, that's, I didn't realize it was a code. Thank you.
Okay, so it seems that with the exception of the narrow exception for reconstruction of architectural elements for life safety purposes, that the board is in agreement with all of this so far?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, that gets us to designation criteria. Before we actually touch on this, I realized there was one item I did not include on the PowerPoint that was in the staff report. So with the zoning exception process, again, this is a process that has not been used previously. It's not clear in the code of if the board even reviews these or if the plan commission reviews them. right now, it's clear that the city council approves them, but it's not clear how you get there. So the recommendation there is for the decision-making to actually be pushed down from the city council to the planning commission, which would be kind of consistent with a standard variance application. It's a little strange that it went all the way to the city council, but since planning commission has wide latitude to approve variances, this would be kind of consistent with that, since it's basically a type of variance, but then with a review recommendation by the HPB to the planning commission.
Yeah, and this is one, when I was reading this, that we've talked about this before. It's definitely a carrot for historic properties that we really haven't, the city really hasn't been using. But for me, especially if you have places like Alice Avenue where you have, houses on tiny lots, being able to have a little bit more encroachment as long as your neighbor's not complaining, or being able to have a setback that's a little different or something like that, I think, adds a benefit to these historic homes that in general have a lot more burdens on them.
Correct. Yeah, the one that we may be seeing next year actually is on Alice Avenue. So it does actually provide an interesting case study. So when that one comes through, even though the code is not clear about it, the board reviews it. We'll certainly have the board review it, and we'll need to discuss internally. The planning commission may need to look at it, but minimally the board will review it and provide a recommendation to the council some point next year if they decide to proceed with it. All right, and then this takes us to the designation criteria. So this was the desk item that was sent to you. Unfortunately, the PDF generator and Word didn't carry over the red lines, but this is what the red lines were showing. So this is the existing criteria, then with some additional wording to just kind of highlight, kind of the more locally important stuff, and just trying to indicate that these things that are notable are important to the community. We're specifically talking about this community. And I think D is probably going to be very important. We're using the word representative characteristics of the type of architectural styles that are present within this community.
I'm not sure which.
We are on designation. This is on page 8 of the staff report.
Oh,
And yeah, the desk memo. So right now, for instance, this has come up with a couple of historic resource analysis reports that have been brought to the board. There was one a few years ago on 96 East Rincon. That building basically was found not historic using the existing criteria, but largely because arguably the criteria is a little too detached from the city itself. So trying to say, like with instance number D, that things that are representative of characteristics, architecture in Campbell is important. So if we have a lot of craftsmen, then it's understood that craftsman homes are important, and just trying to really make that clear. That's kind of what we're doing here. And then also with E, the word notable, it's a little broad. I think using the word local as well kind of highlights that we also mean individuals that have been important to the community's history that were local here, not just necessarily individuals that were notable at a state or regional or national level. Trying to kind of broaden the sense of what's actually historic, so that we can ensure that the current list is more certain, and perhaps open kind of have a little more opportunity for other properties to be added to the list in the future.
Like my house in the future, right?
Exactly.
Now,
Notable and important.
yes. This is certainly an area that is subjective. But unfortunately, historic preservation is kind of by its nature subjective to a big degree.
Yeah.
And then I would also add to that, as part of the formal review, the state will need to be looking at the draft ordinance. So I imagine they'll look at this pretty closely and provide their feedback. We'll see what they say. Yeah, and then
The state.
yes, because we're certified local government. So the Office of Historic Preservation, under our contract with them, I suppose, does require that they review our draft ordinance before adoption. So we'll certainly touch base with them once that gets going. For most part, they just want to make sure that we're not loosening the reins in such a way that risk historic properties, and we're doing the complete opposite. we're making sure it's clear and tight so that there are no more accidents. Now, in terms of the designation process, so it's a little interesting. Currently, if you want to add a property to the list, you are required to submit funds for an historic resource analysis, and that costs about $5,000. Now, if you want to remove a property from the list, that's only required if the Plan Commission and HPB disagree. So it seems like an odd disconnect, because it would seem if the HPB and Plan Commission, using their judgment with staff recommendation, believe that a property should be added to the list, then perhaps an historic resource analysis shouldn't be required either. So the recommendation here is to align the addition and removal process so that the reports are only required where there's a disagreement between the two bodies, which would suggest that there's something going on that maybe does require further analysis. But otherwise, if the Plan Commission and board are both able to make an affirmative determination to the council, then that should be sufficient enough without forcing the property owner to shell out several $1,000s.
No, that makes total sense. In fact, I mean, to me, it should be, if the city wants one, the city should pay for it because, right? I mean, we're not having a whole bunch of people wanting to be added to the list, right? So.
Yeah, and that's something that I kind of want to discuss too as part of the Mills Act discussion of using the Mills Act as an incentive to get properties that are not currently on the list to get on the list.
Yeah.
That would be the city's historic consultant. So currently we do have a consultant under contract. The city will be looking at all of our consultants, including the historic consultant at some point next year. Looking at creating a city council policy that allows for creating a bench of consultants of a variety. Right now, we only have one, probably should at least have two, particularly when he may be involved in a project where he can't necessarily review himself. So,
Right.
yeah, just, yes.
Yeah.
So, yeah, he's under a city contract. So, but he also does work in the community. And I mean, so if there were a situation where we needed to analyze his work, then that does present a conflict of interest, obviously, that right now we're actually not geared up to deal with without then having to find somebody else. So in any event, that's something we'll be working on. But generally, these really should only be, again, required where there's kind of something a question that can't be answered by staff, the board, or the Plan Commission. And then also be looking at some definitions. Basically new definitions, particularly character defining features. I've looked at a lot of codes. One would think that would actually be a pretty common definition. It really isn't. A lot of historic preservation ordinances are exceedingly ambiguous. I mean, going through this exercise, I understand why, because it's really hard to kind of really nail down what makes something important. But I think for character defining features, we'll probably make it fairly broad so that we really capture all elements that constitute a house, because really it's the whole thing that makes it important. And if you start touching pieces of it, it's important that we kind of look at it holistically. I was hoping to actually try to draft some definitions for this meeting, but just time ran out. But in any event, that'll be part of the draft ordinance that will be reviewed next year. If there are any other definitions that you feel are important, feel free to send me an email subsequently. We can look at trying to incorporate those into the draft. And that is it.
Excellent. Well, that's a great, yes, I feel very accomplished going through today's meeting. Even though Danny did all the work. Great. Well, if no other comments, then for next meeting, is there any preview before we adjourn?
So next meeting will be the Mills Act discussion. So we have all the recommendations that were put together by the subcommittee. Some of that actually we had initially started to draft as part of the city council report that had gone to the council in terms of authorizing the Mills Act program, but we decided to actually pull that back and first get council authorization to actually work on it before we just threw a lot of stuff at them. So this will be basically a meeting where we'll discuss the the subcommittee's recommendations on a much more fine grain level detail. With a lot more staff feedback though, which I know in the past was lacking. So that'll be kind of coming here to see where we agree or disagree and suggestions for improvements. I mean, that one's going to be a little more tricky because again, that really has a lot of open-ended questions that don't necessarily have just clear right answers. And yeah, so if we get through all that, then the idea would be getting to that joint study session with the Planning Commission in February, and that'll be after the board's regular meeting. So I think it's going to be a busy Plan Commission meeting. We'll have basically just the two items. We'll have the study session, and then they'll also be doing an objective standards meeting as well. And then depending on how that meeting goes, we'll hopefully look at a council meeting in March, where the council will then review the Plan Commission HPB recommendations on the three legs of the effort. And if they're in general agreement, then authorize us to draft the formal ordinance. Then that's my work then to take all of this and actually put it into actionable legislative language, where we're actually looking at the current ordinance and doing a lot of red lines. So we kind of scheduled 2 months for that. And then we'll get that off to review by our city attorney and our and OHP, the Office of Historic Preservation. And hopefully all that can be ready for public hearing review by July. And there is a bit of a timing issue here, because ideally we can get if we can get this done by late summer, there might be an opportunity to actually review and approve some Mills Act contracts next year. I don't want the clock to run out because those need to be adopted before end of the year. Otherwise, we basically lose a whole year.
Yeah.
So that's my goal. Frankness, that the schedule is pretty aggressive. There's a lot going on our department next year, so we'll do our best to keep to it, but things can happen.
One thing I wanted to ask, with the new tier 1 definition, that creating additional work for the director, is the director open to taking that on?
In practice, the tier 1 permits are going to be approved by staff planner under the director's authority. If there's an unusual situation, we'll certainly bring it to his attention, but generally it's not something he would see on a day-to-day basis.
Okay.
That's kind of the bulk of our work are just a lot of administrative actions, minor additions, fences, tree removal permits, of a lot of day-to-day assistant planner work.
Okay.
And so in a lot of ways too, all this actually, right now I'm for most part doing all of the city's historic work. So some of this will actually allow some of this work to go to our more junior staff moving forward. And you will actually meet her some point next year, because we do have an application for 415 East Campbell Avenue that she was assigned to give her a little experience with historic properties.
Right.
And the next,
To be added.
no, just some minor alterations. And then in January, the board will need to select a new chair and vice chair, and also a SARC advisor. No, we haven't done that for a little while, but technically the code requires that the Sign Architectural Review Committee, which is a subcommittee of the Planning Commission, also have a historic advisor from the HPB. So, and that's technically supposed to be done annually. So we'll do that as well in January, because we actually will need it for the 415 East Campbell Avenue project, probably in February.
All right, great. Any other questions? All right, well, then we are adjourned at 6:39.